Well, hello Gold Coasters, and a particular hello and welcome to the Gold Coast Libraries. This is a virtual author event with me, Tanya Heaslip, here in Central Australia. Now, I've never done one of these before, so it's very new to me and it's probably new to you. So forgive any mistakes as we go along, but I think we're going to have about 30 minutes of conversation, a little reading from my new book, and some general discussion. And I hope you enjoy it. So I should start by saying that I'm here in the beautiful Todd River that flows through Alice Springs. Alice Springs is the name of my new book, which I'll just hold up so you can see, An Alice Girl. Right now, this beautiful Todd River, which sometimes has water in it, sometimes not, is a place that I spent much of my childhood. Not exactly here, but this river flows, well, in fact, it comes from the north, which is where I come from, and flows down. But these beautiful big dry creek beds and old gum trees are exactly what Alice represents, and hence my book. I've also got some notes here, so if you see me every now and then looking down at my notes, please forgive me. 30 minutes is a long time to remember everything. So why are we here? Back to this again, An Alice Girl. This is also exciting for me because I'm filming this the very early morning of the day of my launch. So it feels most auspicious to be joining you. An Alice Girl is the story of my growing up here in Central Australia, in this beautiful outback land, this raw, magical, harsh outback land, in the 60s, the 1960s and the early 70s. It's full of adventures of how and why my parents came here, growing up here, and a life of isolation and imagination unimaginable to most Australians, I think. So I'm going to talk about a number of my own, I suppose, insights into the book, and then I'll answer questions at the end that the Gold Coast Library has sent to me. Just going to rub my hands because, of course, we're in the desert. And the desert in Central Australia is very cold in winter. In fact, it goes down to -1 and -2. We're not there yet, but it's still very fresh. In a couple of hours, I'll be in a t-shirt. That's the remarkable nature of the desert. Freezing in the morning and glorious by midday, probably by 10 o'clock. And this is May, our winter. So let me talk to you a little about what An Alice Girl covers. As I said, it mentions my parents. My mum was this young, free, adventurous, spirited girl who grew up in the Flinders Ranges, in fact, in South Australia. So that was pretty isolated in its own way back then, country, rural South Australia. And she longed for a more exciting life. And she read Neville Shute's A Town Like Alice, and she thought, that's the place for me. When she was 18, she found a job here. Now, you think, how can that be so exciting or unusual or different? But back in 1957, that was incredibly unusual, especially for a girl from a very conservative country town in the Flinders Ranges. She came here, she fell in love with it. She wanted to stay forever, but there was this boy. There's always a love interest somewhere, isn't there? And he drew her back. In fact, he was her childhood sweetheart. So he wanted to marry her, and I think they did it was a bit of a compromise. I'll marry you, says Mum, if you come back to the territory with me. This is my dad, grew up on a sheep station in the Flinders Ranges, and he was very much of pioneering stock, and that idea excited him. His background was Irish. They'd come out of Ireland fleeing the potato famine in the 1700s and were starving, and came to South Australia and made a life on the land there. And they'd done it tough, and they'd also, in Dad's lifetime, been through the Second World War that the Depression years and the Cold War. So he was a man greatly influenced by the politics of his time and also that hard work ethic of the Methodists out of Ireland. So the two of them together thought, right, this is an adventure. So that's the background. There are many twists and turns before they were able to come back to Alice, but they found this tiny little block called Bond Springs that was deemed unviable at the time, but it was the only one they could afford, and they arrived in a 10-year drought. So, what possibly could go wrong? They came with 3 children under 4. I was the eldest. They were 26. Such big responsibilities on their shoulders, but they set up here and were determined to make a go of it. Their life was very tough, and we grew up in that very tough existence. The landscape was tough. Slim Dusty, in fact, wrote a song called "It's a hard, hard country, it's a hard, hard land, and to live in it you have to be a hard, hard man or woman." That's what the outback is, and that's what we were raised in. But for us it was completely normal. So it was paradise. We had all this freedom, we had all this space. We had these magnificent dry riverbeds to run through. We had big blue skies as far as the eye could see. Nobody else. Our pets were our horses, our dogs, the chooks, the cattle. And we trailed around after the stockmen, who were the only other grown-ups in our life, apart from our parents and our long-suffering governesses. I'll come to them in a minute. And our heroes were therefore the stockmen, and so not only did we have unusual friends as playmates, we then also had unusual games and then roles in life as we grew up, because as soon as kids could start to work on a cattle station, they had to go to work because stockmen came and went. We were very isolated. It was a huge area. Many hands were required, and children were the stable part of the workforce, the ones that didn't leave. So we had to learn to ride, drive a Land Rover, fix a bore, fix a fence, muster cattle, live in the stock camp for weeks on end if need be, work in the cattle yards, truck cattle, do everything kids on a cattle station, right across the territory at that time, and probably the rest of Australia were required to do. Certainly northern Queensland, I know the life on the cattle stations there was pretty much the same as the territory, and for that matter northern West Australia. So our life was one of freedom and excitement and hard work. So this book details the adventures we had, the funny people we met, the wild characters, the times on horseback, the unrelenting heat, and for me, the most exciting thing, which was School of the Air. Because I was a very bookish child. My sister Melissa and my brother Brett, and later my younger brother Ben, were all children born for the bush. And I loved the bush, but my heart was mostly with my books in our schoolroom. So we had a tiny little schoolroom where we had a governess. A governess was a girl about 18 who came usually from South, not a teacher, but who could supervise the lessons of the children, because my mum worked non-stop feeding up to 20 men a day, huge slabs of beef cooked over a wood fire stove, looking after all the children, running the homestead. She was on the go from dawn till dusk. So a governess would supervise our lessons, and we learnt in the most interesting way. We had correspondence school, and they were lessons, written lessons that came up in a set. They were called a set. Came up every fortnight to Alice Springs, were delivered to us. We got them, we worked away, followed the lessons, and then sent them back. They would be marked in Adelaide at the correspondence school and then returned to us. It might be a month before we got the marks back and we had to remember what we did or didn't do, but I remember waiting with such excitement and anticipation for the lessons to come back and to see whether we'd got a gold star. I'd got a gold star, and hopefully not too many red marks, but gold stars. And I had this gorgeous teacher who I never met. Her name was Mrs. Layton. And she had little animals, a stamp of little animals, and she'd put them on when she really liked something along with the gold stars. So that was very exciting. But then the most exciting part of my education was School of the Air. Now you will have all heard of School of the Air, especially in recent times, I expect, because distance and remote education has become very topical in the time of COVID. And School of the Air was like theatre for me, just like theatre. So once a day, well, let me start again. We went into our schoolroom at 7:30 in the morning and did lessons until 1. And in the middle of that, for half an hour, we'd go out and have our School of the Air lesson. So once upon a time, when it was set up by John Flynn of the Outback, there were pedal radios, and the kids had to pedal with their feet to get the radio going, and then they'd talk on a microphone through the static to the correspondence, to the School of the Air, wherever they were. I was very lucky. By the time I started in 1968, we had a little radio about this big with a microphone. We didn't have to pedal. So we'd talk through the static to the School of the Air, which was based in Alice Springs, and for half an hour each day I could talk to a teacher, again, that I couldn't see, but I could hear students, and we didn't know what they looked like, but we could hear their voices, and they came from stations around us, a radius of about 700 square miles. So it was there that I met my best friend, Janie Joseland. We became best friends in grade 2. We didn't actually meet and see each other face to face until I think probably grade 4 or 5. We were about 6 years old when we met, and about 9 when we saw each other for the first time, which, as you can imagine, was incredibly exciting. But School of the Air offered us this great opportunity to talk to teachers, to hear other students, and to be taken out of our isolation for a brief moment, for about half an hour. So they're the kinds of themes that my book covers. Excuse me, I just have to have a little sip of water. I hope you're enjoying this so far. Can you hear the cockies in the creek, the pink cockatoos? They can be an absolute menace because in drought times they strip the leaves off the trees, but they're so much an integral part of the sound of the riverbed. Just got to get this lid back on correctly. So I hope that you will all now have your appetites whetted to learn a little bit more about the book by reading it, taking it out from your beautiful library at the Gold Coast. One of the questions I've been asked over and over again is, why did I want to write this book? What was so important about it? I think this story's always been with me. My upbringing was so normal, but people throughout my life would say your upbringing was not normal. It was very different. It was very unusual. You were isolated. You could go for a month before your mother went to town to get provisions, and she'd come back with a box of books for me from School of the Air, which I just loved. But that was not normal, whatever normal is, but these were very different times. And so I started to think, maybe I should write some of these stories down one day. But what happened in the meantime, and here's what I'd like to show you next, I went to Prague. Now, the amazing thing about growing up in the bush was that it fostered my curiosity and love of learning about other places. And Prague and the Czech Republic drew me in 1994, just 4 years after the Berlin Wall fell. And last year in May, I published Alistair Prague, which talks about my adventures of going behind the Iron Curtain just after communism had fallen. I thought Central Europe was exotic, but a very dear friend said to me, you know, Central Australia is probably as exotic to most Australians as Central Europe is. And that really got me thinking, so that led to this book. In the midst of the writing of these 2 books, my father died, which was incredibly difficult. But one of the joys of writing this book is that he was still alive in every way as I wrote it. And so there was a great joy in going back to all the memories and stories of my childhood. So these 2 books, thanks to Alan and Unwin, are now out in the world, and hopefully the Gold Coast has also got a copy of Alistair Prague, and if not, please ask them to get it in for you. So can I just check with my wonderful cameraman husband what the time? Oh, perfect. Thank you very much. Now I'm going to some questions. The first question from the Gold Coast Library is, how did your early years growing up in isolation shape me as a person? I think that's a really good question, because these are the kinds of characteristics you only really glean perhaps in later years when you look back at your life, but without a doubt resilience and hard work. In the bush you have no one to look after you. If you're out mustering cattle on the back of a horse and you're gone for a day, you're on your own. You could be gone in the stock camp for a week or more. You're a kid, you're on a big horse, you're chasing cattle. It's rough and dangerous work. It's usually stinking hot or bitterly cold. There's never enough water, you're always perishing. You're hungry. You know that these are really tough conditions even for men, but for kids to do this, we had to be so tough, and you fall off and you had to get back on, and there'd be nobody to help you out. You're in the middle of the bush, in the middle of nowhere. So it taught me resilience. I've fallen over so many times in my life in so many ways, but that training teaches you, as my dad would say, to get back on the horse, which literally, figuratively, metaphorically applies, I think, to life. The other thing it really did, as I mentioned earlier, was foster my creativity. We had wild imaginations because we had nothing to fetter our thinking. I had these fantastic books that came from School of the Air. Now, interestingly, back in the 60s and 70s, almost all the books were Enid Blyton and set in the 30s and 40s of England, or they were Heidi, or they were some fabulous Australian books from Colin Tearley, Sun on the Stubble, those kinds of stories, and Seven Little Australians. They were all adventure books, and they absolutely fostered my imagination. So I would write stories, and I would tell stories to myself. I would tell stories to my siblings. I'd tell stories to my new best friend Janie Josten on School of the Air. That gave me a chance to really develop an imagination that I was then able to put into good use into writing. And I did go on and study law, which, may I say, is not particularly helpful for imagination or creativity. At least it wasn't for me, because it takes you into that logical, analytical side of your brain. To write, you really have to be in that other place. So when I write, I'm so thankful I've got that deep imagination to draw on. Sometimes it takes a while to get back into that place, because today I still work in legal. I'm a legal consultant, and I still work almost full time dealing with legal matters. So that means I have to take myself into beautiful places like this so that my imagination can be revived. The other thing it did teach me was independence, because you have to become like a little grown-up as a kid for all the reasons that I've mentioned. And I think of all of those characteristics drawn together have really helped me during this recent, very difficult time of COVID-19. And I've been asked whether those early lessons helped prepare me for COVID-19. To be honest, I don't think anything could have prepared us for this. But definitely the capacity to work alone, to work independently, to be creative, to find ways to manage new and difficult situations, that all those life skills and the way I've lived my life, I think helped me certainly, because I'm used to being very independent and taking responsibility for myself and the situations I find myself in. I think the very difficult thing about this time that nobody could prepare themselves for was the terrible economic loss that we've felt across Australia, across the world. Here in Central Australia, tourism now is a big part of our economy. In fact, it almost underpins our economy, and all the small businesses here work for and rely on tourism. So seeing the economy smashed here and people losing jobs and struggling financially has been very difficult, as it has right across Australia and the world. But it does remind me of a story, again, of my dad. He would always say, when things are tough, you tighten your belt. You just tighten your belt. And I remember very well as a kid, we had this Dutchman who came to us, and he was a fabulous carpenter, and Mum had got him to do some building work. And one day we'd had a cattle sale go wrong. Dad left the cattle sale, came home, marched straight in and said to Mr. Govers, that was his name, stop work right now. And he was mid-sawing a piece of wood, and in the middle of this job, Dad said, that's it, stop. It was tighten the belt and tighten it now. That was his motto for surviving financial difficulties, and he came from that background of the Depression years, and with that history of the potato famine in Ireland, never far from his mind was fiscal frugality. So I think that's something that's helped me during this time to remember that we are all capable of doing that, and to stop and instead take in the great beauty around us. Can I just ask, please, what the time is from the fabulous cameraman? Oh, 20 minutes, thank you. We've got 10 minutes to go. This has gone so fast. I hope you're enjoying it. I hope you're enjoying the stories. There are more cockatoos, and the sun's rising here over the hills. You probably can't see the sun very much from where you are, sadly. But the hills are glowing, the top of the hills are glowing. The other thing that I think's been really interesting to come out of this COVID-19 process, for want of a better term, is the importance of remote education and distance learning. And in that respect, School of the Air, my humble old School of the Air, based here in Alice Springs, the first School of the Air in the world, has acted now as an inspiration really for people needing to remote educate all around the world. The School of the Air here has had people from Switzerland, from Germany, from Africa, from I think the UK, and definitely from the States, calling for advice. How do we manage this distance education? How do we manage online learning? So our humble School of the Air, which began in 1951 here, as a pedal radio, is now providing advice around the world and inspiration and support to people who are learning from home or learning somewhere but not at school. We had a call the other day from a journalist in London, which was fascinating, and he was so interested in this whole issue. He's been talking to former School of the Air students from Alice Springs to prepare an article. He's even thinking of a TV series. He thinks it's so interesting about what our lives were like then and the lessons that people now self-educating can take. And he discovered that there's a young Australian boy aged 8 now living in Manchester in England who has joined the Alice Springs School of the Air for his education. So he's now doing his lessons completely about face. So he's getting up in the middle of the night to start his lessons and working through the night and sleeping during the day. And his mother says it's working a treat. He feels connected back to Australia and he's loving being online. So there you go, School of the Air reigns. And if you have a chance at all, look up your local School of the Air, because they now are everywhere in Australia, and support them, because they just do the most fantastic work and give kids like me an opportunity to have fantastic education and to go on into the world and to be able to go to university, study law, practice law, write books, and have an amazing life. And the School of the Air and Correspondence School was my foundation for sure. I've just got a few more questions. Yes. Well, the question is, are you still an outback girl, and where are you most at home? I think this says it all. I've lived all over the world, and I've lived all over Australia, and I've practiced law in many different places, but this is home. It's in my heart, it's in my blood, it's in my soul, and yeah, this is where I feel connected, very connected to this land. So I think I'd like to finish by just doing a short reading for you. How much time do I have, please, Mr. Cameraman? 5 minutes. Perfect, perfect, perfect. This is right from the start of the story. It's the prologue, The Cattle Duffers. And imagine it's set somewhere not far from here. Cooey! The call ripped through the hot, still air. I swiveled in the saddle, hands tight on the reins, straining to catch the direction of the sound. My skewbald mare Sandy moved restlessly under me, her ears pricked, sensing my anxiety. To the west lay a rocky rise, shrouded by blue-grey mulga, but if the sound had come from behind the rise, it was impossible to tell. Behind me a dry creek bed dropped away to the south, lined by river gums wilting in the summer afternoon heat. There was no sign of anyone there, nor did it seem a likely hideout. I cupped my hands around my mouth and shouted in return, "Cooey!" The words hit the low hills and reverberated back, while above a hawk rose into the vastness on the currents of a willy-willy. Like my shout, the hawk was soon a speck in the emptiness, swallowed by the big blue bowl of sky above. Sweat ran down the back of my thin cotton shirt. The sun burned my arms. Time was running out. So I hope that has whetted your appetite to grab a copy from the library as soon as it comes in, and also grab a copy of Alistair Prague if you have the chance. So in a sense, An Alice Girl is the prequel. This is where it all began. This is the story of growing up here. This is the story of me in my 30s exploring a wonderful, wonderful new exotic place. And I guess both books are a blend of the exoticness of Central Australia. So to answer the very last question, which is what's next for me and An Alice Girl, I am just so excited at the chance to tell people about this raw, magical, beautiful countryside, to tell them about what life was like here, and to share the stories of a world that most people, especially on the coast, don't know about or haven't experienced themselves. And perhaps excitingly, to really learn about the importance of School of the Air, find out what it does, find out how it helps students, and broaden our story across Australia of the outback and the importance of what the outback can teach you as a person. So I'm not able to go on tour at the moment, and I'm not able to take this book out to regional places, which I'd once hoped to do, but I really hope that with this magic of virtual conversations, through the magic of technology, you'll have gained an insight into this story and a sense of the beauty here. And I also invite you to contact me and let me know your thoughts and your ideas. I've got a Facebook page at Tanya Heaslip Author. So please go on to at Tanya Heaslip Author, send me some comments, and I have a website, tanyaheaslip.com.au. Have I got that right, Mr. Cameraman? tanyaheaslip.com.au. It also has a where to buy page. So the other thing is, in addition to supporting your library, support your local bookshops. And I would love to have your feedback. I'd love to hear what you thought of this and our morning here in Central Australia. And enjoy. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Thank you, Gold Coast Libraries. Thank you, everyone. Bye.